Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are welcome to the annual Stephen Ellis Research Lecture. We organized this event here at the African Studies Center to honor Stephen Ellis, firstly as a great scholar that he was, and secondly to encourage others to walk in his spirit. Stephen Ellis was a renowned researcher, senior researcher at the African Studies Center, Leiden. He was a courageous, deeply inquisitive researcher who combined a great interest in how real politics work and have an impact on people's lives with a fascination for the role of religion and morality. This he did from the vantage point of being an historian. Every year, a committee consisting of the director of the African Studies Center, Professor Malin Decker, the chair of the ASCL Researchers Assembly, your humble, and Professor Gerite here, Stephen's widow. We invite a scholar to give the annual lecture. But before I talk about this annual lecture, just give me a couple of moments. I'd like to thank Rick Young-Ellen. Thank you so much for your energy and your kindness in organizing today's event. We also remember Marike van Wending at this moment for our dedication to previous events that has had distinguished presenters such as Emmanuel Achempong from Harvard, Jonathan Jansen of Stellenbosch, Nanjala Yambola, independent writer and researcher, Henrietta Moore of UCL, Camilo Kavanagh, King's College, Mona Nduro Cornell, and Howard French of Columbia. May Marike van Wending rest in peace. Amen. Today, the 2022 Stephen Ellis Annual Lecture will be given by Megan Vaughan, Professor Megan Vaughan. In Nigeria, we say Vaughan.
Oh, that's it. Whatever.
Professor of African History and Health at University College London. Megan was formerly Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at the University of Cambridge and Professor of Commonwealth Studies at the University of Oxford. She is a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Historical Society. She is now working on a Wellcome Trust-funded history of epidemiological change in Africa. The title of her presentation today is Africa in the Time of Coronavirus, Biology, History, and Politics. You're welcome.
This is working. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Yinka, to everybody in the African Studies Centre. It's a real honour to have been invited to give this talk. I mean that very sincerely. I also want to just apologise in advance. I have a chronic condition of the larynx, and normally for the last few years I've turned down every big speaking engagement, but I really didn't want to turn this one down. Firstly, because Stephen was a very valued colleague of mine, but also because he was a very dear friend, warm, generous, and a lot of fun. So I really miss him, as I think some other people in the room probably do. But we do have his work. So let me begin my presentation. Get this up. I thought of Stephen when I read the perceptive and provocative. Oh, sorry.
Apologies.
video won't have any sound.
Okay. But I should have also said, thank you. I think that goes without saying that without his very patient organisation, I wouldn't even be at this point, any further down the line. I thought of Stephen when I read the perceptive and provocative blog on COVID in Africa by the Congolese-German writer George Kibala. We all know, he wrote in September 2020, that the Western media consistently erases the agency and ingenuity of African governments, communities, and individuals. But responses to this in the form of, and I quote him, Africa is doing great with COVID, are as problematic as Africa is hopeless in the face of a crisis. Both lack nuance, downplay the complexity of the situation, and still, he says, operate within the Western gaze. Binary meta-narratives are two sides of the same coin. They also lack humility, he writes. We still have so much to learn about the crisis, the trade-offs, the huge social and economic costs of lockdown measures. As you all know, Stephen published Seasons of Rain in 2011 at the height of the Africa Rising discourse and of Africa's deepening relationship with China. Stephen was no Afro-pessimist, but he was critical of some of the hype that was around at that time. Many emerging features of Africa's place in the world, he wrote, are neither surprising nor alarming. If they appear unexpected, it is only because outsiders so often think about Africa in the form of a few tired old cliches. As Kibala implies, many of those tired old cliches are still around. But Seasons of Rain struck another chord with me as I thought about this talk. He took the title of the book from a poem by the Cameroonian Simon Pondo and quoted a segment. The season of rains signs its name in 1,000 fashions. Those who want to read the omens there will find the signs. When the rains arrive in the Cameroon, Stephen wrote, drawing on this poem, they cause the maize to flower, the swallows to migrate, and the spider to spin its web. But the signs that people read into these movements are always ambiguous. In the end, Stephen wrote, the omens offered by the start of the rainy season are unsure and tell us more about the season that has just passed than about what comes next. Reading the signs of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa also calls for ambiguity, and I think tells us more about the past than what comes next. But I would argue that that past is not that of Africa alone, but of an interconnected world in which events in even the remotest locations on the planet have repercussions for us all. That past also tells us that when epidemics begin and when they end is not at all self-evident. I'm going to divide this talk into three sections. Firstly, I'll outline the state of knowledge of the epidemiology of COVID in Africa with all its uncertainties and discuss the so-called African paradox. And this comes with a huge amount of hesitation because I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't understand all the models, and also the data, as I will describe, is very uncertain. In the second part, I'll move from the bird's eye view of epidemiology to the more on-the-ground analysis of researchers working within local communities when the pandemic began. Drawing on their work, I'll argue that an epidemic is not one thing, but many, intersecting with existing precarities and uncertainties. And finally, remembering that Stephen was, before anything else, a historian, I'll move to history and temporality. using historical examples of other epidemics in Africa, argue that though, as Kabbalah suggests, biosocial lessons from Africa are best avoided, there is something we can learn from these past examples, some uncomfortable facts about the complex nature of epidemics, including their open-endedness. So to begin, epidemiological uncertainties and the African paradox. Most of the discussion of the continent's experience of COVID has focused on the so-called African paradox, the not unreasonable expectation that a continent with a high proportion of people living in poverty and generally weak public health systems, already stretched to deal with a range of infectious diseases, would be very gravely affected by this new and massive new challenge. Yet the figures at one level appear to tell a different story. Let me start by saying that there's a huge level of uncertainty attached to any statistics for COVID globally, but perhaps especially for many parts of Africa. Because both case numbers and confirmed deaths from COVID are so unreliable, most epidemiologists use figures of excess mortality to assess the impact of the pandemic. As I'm sure you know, excess mortality is mortality above what would be expected based on the non-crisis rate of mortality in any given population. This map, produced by Johns Hopkins University and dated October 2022, shows the cumulative difference per million of population between the reported number of deaths since the 1st of January 2020 and the projected number of deaths for the same period based on previous years. The most striking thing about this map, of course, is the glaring gap of data for Africa, not just Africa, but certainly for Africa, with only South Africa and Egypt showing up at all. This graph from the same source does, however, give an indication of where South Africa's excess mortality lies. South Africa is one of the countries that does have excess mortality.
Zoom. Non, j'écoute une conférence.
So we can see South Africa in comparison there with some other countries that fared worse. Epidemiologists have ways around this lack of data, and I'll refer to those in a minute. But I think it's worthwhile just pausing here to emphasize the uncertainty attached to any statements about COVID in Africa. After dire warnings at the beginning of the pandemic about the probable impact on Africa, epidemiologists were soon puzzling over the apparently slow burn of the continent's epidemic. Even though there was an absence of reliable statistics, it was still obvious on the ground in hospitals and communities across the continent that serious cases were relatively few. Some heralded an African success story. The tables were turned as Europe and North America struggled to contain the epidemic and face the horrors of mass death. The once part of darkness, so-called, seemed to be relatively unscathed. Some pointed correctly to the fact that even though lacking resources, African governments and publics had demonstrated an impressive degree of preparedness, maybe not exactly the preparedness imagined by global health security experts with their sophisticated surveillance systems, but the preparedness of health systems and communities familiar with infectious diseases and the need to prevent them at a local level. At the height of the pandemic, in Zoom calls with colleagues around the continent, and I'm sure many of you had the same experience, this emerged to me and my colleagues very clearly. While the UK government bypassed local health authorities, put its faith in apps and the private sector, and instituted a top-down, and as we now know, definitively useless test and trace system, issuing in the process massive contracts to their friends and allies. African communities mobilized locally, drew on their experience of other disease outbreaks, a kind of embedded epidemiological expertise, if you like, spread the word, washed their hands, instituted whatever measures were practicable. Much was made of the prior experience of Ebola and other infectious diseases in some parts of the continent, and the lessons that have been learned from that. Thanks to social media, the whole world could see people in Africa enthusiastically wearing masks, grateful that they had them, while in the USA, COVID deniers physically wrested masks off customers entering supermarkets. If Africa had once appeared to be the continent of biomedical skeptics, it now really had some very fierce competition. But how paradoxical, in fact, was the African paradox? In August 2020, so a few months into the pandemic, Linda Norling, writing in Science, outlined the apparent puzzle. In the absence of widespread testing, scientists use seroprevalence studies to estimate the extent of COVID infections. Using July 2020 data collected from 3,000 blood donors in Kenya, Sophie Uyoga from the Kenya Medical Research Institute estimated that 1 in 20 Kenyans aged 15 to 64 had antibodies, an indication of past infection. That would have put Kenya on a par with Spain in mid-May, which was just coming out of its first COVID peak with 27,000 deaths, official deaths. Kenya had 100. And Kenya's hospitals were not reporting large numbers of patients with COVID symptoms. At this stage, everyone was expressing caution, not least because in South Africa, where excess mortality data was available, it showed that between the beginning of May 2020 and the end of July, excess mortality exceeded official COVID deaths by a factor of 4 to 1. But elsewhere in Africa, in the absence of hospitals reporting large numbers of cases, it seemed that something different was happening, or rather not happening. Hypotheses began to emerge: the youthfulness of Africa's population. We're reminded that the median age of Kenya's population is 20, while that of Spain is 42, and that 94% of Africa's population is under 60. Young people we know are much less susceptible to serious illness from COVID. Then there's the weather, living outdoors, in addition perhaps prior exposure undetected to other coronaviruses and different infections had afforded protection. Some people are invoking the protective effects of a diverse microbiome and of parasites. By mid-2021, when the steep human costs of lockdowns and other measures on African populations were becoming only too evident, some African scientists were beginning to voice criticisms of the one pandemic, one size fits all approach. Interviewed in Nature, Professor Oyewale Tamori, a Nigerian virologist and past president of the Nigerian Academy of Science, argued that the epidemiology of Africa was not like that of the West, largely because of its population structure. But, he said, we followed the West gullibly. He described what he saw as the consequences of that. Quote, it was like, COVID is going to kill us all. Then we didn't see anybody dying. And then the interpretation was that COVID is a hoax because we're not seeing a dead body. So when you say we are going to die and we didn't die, you were a liar. Now you come and tell me you come and take the vaccine for what I didn't die of. It's a bigger lie. Trust in science and government, Professor Tamori implied, might be seriously damaged by the non-event, as it arguably had been in the past. Surveillance studies in Lagos, Tamori pointed out, showed that at least 70% of the population had antibodies. They were infected, but they were not dying in significant numbers. I think Tamori's point is well taken, and we'll see more of that later, but it comes with the benefit of hindsight, of course, at least at the beginning of the epidemic, when so little was known about the virus. There seemed few good choices for governments and few alternatives to tried and tested but very crude infection containment measures. Later, the example of India that went from having a mild case of COVID to a tragically full-blown one was a reminder that the epidemic wasn't over, and indeed isn't over. So when direct data is lacking, epidemiologists turn to modeling. The most recent, and as far as I know, most comprehensive modeling was reported by Joseph Kaburi and his colleagues in the Lancet Global Health in August 2022, with some interesting replies and disagreements from colleagues across the continent. Overall, their model concurs that there had been a similar, across the 47 countries in the WHO Africa region, there had been a similar number of infections per head of population as in the rest of the world, but with fewer deaths. But the impact was highly uneven across the continent, ranging from 1.07 deaths per 100,000 population in Chad to 151.66 in South Africa. And these figures were disputed by some South African scientists who think the toll is actually much higher. The impact of the epidemic was not only spatially uneven, but also varied across time, and with the dominance of particular variants. So they estimated that COVID was the 22nd major cause of death in Africa in 2020, but by 2021, it was the 7th, just behind malaria. This fourfold increase of COVID-related deaths coincided with the introduction of the Delta variant, which was much more infectious and caused more severe disease. So it's the spatial unevenness that I think provides one of the clues to understanding the statistics. And once you dig down into that, then the so-called African paradox looks less paradoxical. As Kaburi and his colleagues noted, the highest mortality was experienced in Southern Africa, followed by North African countries, both relatively prosperous regions. It's not helpful to conclude that COVID is, as some have argued, a VIP disease in Africa, affecting the wealthy disproportionately, because it's really nowhere near as simple as that when you look at the impact on poor communities in South Africa, for example. What this does say, however, is that just as in many other parts of the world, the people most vulnerable to severe disease and death from COVID were the old. South Africa has an aging population. And those all suffering from what Leonora Manderson calls a range of cascading comorbidities associated with age, with a damaging globalized food system, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and with polluted environments, COPD and asthma, as well as, on top of that, HIV and TB. In a country like South Africa, with so many immunocompromised individuals and in the absence of a comprehensive vaccination program, the emergence of new and more deadly variants still can't be ruled out. These syndemic factors, at once biological, socioeconomic, and ecological, are almost impossible to disentangle, but together with the political responses, form the so-called underlying conditions into which a new infectious agent has played its way out. In this respect, there is nothing exceptional about Africa, but the heterogeneity of the African experience is a clear demonstration of the fact that an infectious agent rarely acts alone. Of course, the real toll of COVID in Africa has yet to be calculated. The World Bank has stated that though Africa is the region of the world least affected by the disease, it is on course to become the region hardest hit in terms of increased poverty. To assess the real toll of both COVID and of public health responses, we need to move beyond the frame of conventional epidemiology and look further down on the ground. An epidemic is not just one thing, but many. Amongst the many striking visual images of COVID in Africa is the photograph on the right from South Africa of deserted streets during lockdown. The slogan says, "Stay at home," which is the clear message, and if you can, underneath as a kind of afterthought, and actually somebody has crossed out, "if you can," to which might have been added, I think, "if you have one, if you have a home." The South African lockdown was full of tragedies and telling ironies. In the first few weeks of a tough army-enforced lockdown, which included a ban on the sale of alcohol, deaths from so-called unnatural causes, including murders and road accidents, fell, a striking indication of the normal state of affairs. Before too long, however, as direct deaths from COVID mounted in South Africa, so did the human costs of increased unemployment and poverty, not to mention disruptions to schooling and to healthcare for non-COVID conditions, including HIV. Healthcare workers, as I'm sure you remember, died in their thousands in South Africa, as they did elsewhere. Despite rising infection rates, the government was forced into a partial lifting of restrictions. For ordinary people, and especially the poorest in society, COVID was not one event acting alone. It was a deadly infectious disease at the epicenter of a number of intersecting crises, moving at different speeds, from the long, slow emergencies, so-called, of poverty and ecological fragility, and the chronic conditions of inequality, to the sudden overwhelming of health facilities and the rapid vanishing of incomes. If we move our focus from the bird's eye view of the epidemiologist to the ground level of ordinary lives, we can see how COVID intersected with existing social and economic conditions, which of course varies across the continent. So I'm going to do this primarily through drawing on the work of the medical anthropologist Hayley McGregor and her team or colleagues who were carrying out research in rural areas of Sierra Leone and Uganda when the COVID pandemic began. Of course, there are many other examples I could be drawing on, but I just decided it was that their work was particularly illuminating. And their work points both to the heterogeneity across African settings and also to what they call intersecting precarities. In both Sierra Leone and Uganda, preemptive government measures to contain the virus compounded pre-existing uncertainties and, they argue, intensified precarious life, the precarity of lives. The combination of already precarious lives and livelihoods combined with a lack of state welfare support meant that as the epidemic progressed or didn't, people had little choice but to take their own individual and collective action to negotiate and sometimes subvert public health restrictions. In both locations, the disease, threat, and responses to it were, of course, understood in political terms. All over the world, authoritarian governments used the pandemic to increase their powers and flex their muscles. And the African examples of this are really in no way exceptional. They just fit that pattern. Where trust in government was low, skepticism came to the surface rapidly, but often mediated by specific local conditions and prior experiences. A prior epidemic experience, perhaps, the credibility of local as well as national leaders and healthcare professionals. Excuse me, I'm just going to get some water. So when the COVID pandemic was declared, Uganda was already grappling with several other outbreaks of serious disease, yellow fever, to which I will return, and typhoid, and just over the border in DRC, Ebola. The response of Uganda's authoritarian government was swift and far-reaching. In March 2020, schools were closed and they remained completely closed for 2 years. There were restrictions on public transport and on sale of non-food items. More importantly, though, this response was militarized, with local defense forces employed to police the rules. As case numbers and deaths remained low, so suspicion mounted that the government was using COVID to reinforce its authority, and in some places, local resistance emerged. In a scenario that is familiar to us in other parts of the world, mistrust in government combined with the hardships created by public health measures, loss of livelihood, schooling, access to healthcare, and in this case compounded by the fact that there was so little evidence of the disease locally. In the village in which the researchers were located, close to the border with DRC, long-term precarities were by August 2020 intersecting with immediate threats. There were floods that caused widespread damage to crops and compounded the hunger already felt as a result of the public health restrictions. And the frightening prospect of a new outbreak of Ebola just over the border in DRC spreading into Uganda. Villagers were less than impressed by their government's militarized response to what was a multifaceted threat to their lives and livelihoods. As one woman perceptively put it to researchers, since I came to this earth, I've never heard that a disease can be watched by a gun. I don't think a disease can be stopped by a gun. Amidst all of this, there was another pandemic-induced survival strategy, which was humor. Some of it dark, some simply reflecting on the ironies which all of us, I guess, confronted. In this clip, which I hope is going to be, why is it not live?
Maybe on the left, at the bottom, there's one that's not on that.
Sorry, on yeah, well, I embedded the difference. And the last time I played it was that. Let's try and find it, actually. Can we just look and find it? It's, yeah. You can have a break from my voice. It's really want to show you this because it's very fun. And I'm sorry, we had some communication about this, so I'm embedding this in it. Yeah. Okay. This one.
Look the other side. Like, look on the side. Don't look here. Focus that side.
Oh, we need a bit more volume.
You are okay. As far as Corona is concerned, you are okay. The other problems that you have, I might... Wait. Yes, you can go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, hello.
Please.
What's wrong with you?
What do you mean, what's wrong?
Come on, I have an emergency in the ER.
Yes, if you have ER, even me, I'm in the GMS, General Medical Security. You do not just pass eyes through me just because you
I
are
have
a doctor.
patient who
You
is
never even
dead.
greet me. You don't greet me. Even when you pass here, you don't greet me.
Why should I greet you when the emergency is running?
You mean? Actually, social distance. Push behind, social distance. Where's your mask? Where's your mask? You're just here, Maraga, but I'm going to the ER. You're going to the emergency room. Me, I'm dealing with a general pandemic that has affected the whole worldwide. You're here talking about just a single individual who is in an emergency.
Someone is dying inside there.
The whole, do you know how many people are dying? Do you know how many people have died in outside countries because of this disease?
But we're not in outside
I'm dealing
countries.
with a bigger Sir, simply because you are a doctor and you're wearing white, don't think you're superior. I'm also in white today. We are all superior. Let's all be superior in our positions. If you do not have what takes to work, you're not going to cross. You're not going to cross. Actually, as a matter of fact, I dare you, cross. Cross if you think you are a man. Cross.
What is wrong with you?
Please. Where's your mask? Eh? Where's your mask? I have a job to do here. Even me, I have a checklist. I'm actually going to check to see if you can pass. Rubbish. Hey, my friend, you can look at me and pass eyes through me, but I come from a long line of doctors. My great-grandmother was a witch doctor.
If anything happens,
My great-grandmother was a witch doctor. I remember I trained the daughter, and in turn, before I left, medicine has been in my blood. For you, you had to study it. So don't think you are superior, my friend.
I think you got the picture. Rick, I need to go back to, I went to the high end, demands on this poor guy get more and more unreasonable. But I think she's wonderful. Thanks. So to turn now to the case study of Sierra Leone, the first cases occurred there in March 2020, but preparations have been taking place since January. The president of Sierra Leone prepared the way with her early speech and press briefings, and there were songs and generally spreading the very frightening news that COVID-19 was a threat to everyone, airborne and invisible. Control measures familiar from Ebola outbreaks were repurposed and mobilized. And in the village where the researchers were, there was a kind of anticipatory mood that was mixed. Very real fear combined with a speculation that this was either a disease manufactured in the West to harm Africans, or more reassuringly, a disease of Europe, the US and China, and not real for Sierra Leoneans. Over time, as people had little direct experience or no direct experience with this new disease, views began to shift. Many people concluded that if it existed at all, it just wasn't very dangerous, or that, like malaria, it would be around for a long time and would just have to be lived with. But others, like one woman interviewed by the researchers, felt anxious about the larger and long-term future. She said, I am worried about this disease. If it has brought everything to a halt in the whole world, how will Africans survive when they solely depend on the Western world? So reference to aid and dependency. The uncertainties brought confusion, but also pragmatic actions. The restrictions on trade, for example, especially food trade, were completely unworkable. Villages in this region were dependent on imported rice, but couldn't get to the nearest town to buy it. So in June, traders reopened the markets in defiance of the authorities. Faced with growing hunger, COVID rules were widely ignored, and no significant effort, unlike in Uganda, was made to enforce them. One partial exception was mask wearing in public places in town or at roadblocks, worn more to appease the police and avoid a beating up than as a protection against disease. And many motorcycle taxi drivers said they really valued these masks because of the dust protection. So in both of these locations, in Uganda and in Sierra Leone, to different degrees, government actions taken to contain the anticipated epidemic brought new hardships and intersected with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Without comprehensive formal social safety nets, people did their best to work around these conditions, weighing up and responding to perceived risks of illness, hunger, long-term impoverishment, conflict with authorities to make their lives livable. And I think to go back to the kind of dualism that George Kabbalah-Bao refers to at the beginning of my talk, it is, the writers, the anthropologists reporting on these cases very much emphasize precarity and insecurity, and how COVID was just one of those extra things on top of all these existing issues that people had to deal with. But of course, you could talk about resilience in these communities too. So you can turn the story to resilience or to insecurity. And there is a lot of ambiguity, I think, as Stephen would have argued. There's a lot of ambiguity around these stories and how we interpret them. Of course, the villagers in neither place could foresee or prepare for what some economists are predicting to be the deep and long-term consequences for many people on the continent, made more likely by the enduring vaccine inequity. And I'm sorry that I don't have time to talk about a very important issue, but they would argue that vaccine inequity means that recovery potentially is slower. As with the epidemiology, there's a lot of uncertainty in many of the economic forecasts, but they do make for sober reading on schooling, on healthcare, on food security, and macroeconomic measures. All the effects have a disproportionate impact on the poor, with IFPRI at one point predicting that the number of people defined as poor in sub-Saharan Africa will increase by 15% in rural areas and 44% in urban areas. And in a particularly depressing document produced by UNDP, the predicted economic downturn will have long-term impacts on human development, which they measure primarily through child mortality. They forecast a significant increase in what they call indirect mortality, which is a strange term, a measure of people who will die by 2030 who would not have died without the economic downturn. And they say that this increase will be dominated by the mortality of under-5s. So to quote the Nigerian writer Teju Cole, who was blogging about COVID from his base in the United States, I keep thinking about the floods and how only after the waters recede do the bodies of the drowned become visible. So as the long-term forecasts remind us, and as historians have debated, it's not obvious when an epidemic has ended. Similarly, can we really be sure when they begin? And this is where I step onto my final section on history. As Guillaume Lachenal has rightly observed, the COVID pandemic presented historians of medicine with a rather unfamiliar experience of intense media interest. We may not have been as glamorous or in demand as our epidemiology colleagues, but there were many opportunities for those few minutes of fame on CNN or the BBC. Why? Well, it seems that because when faced with the terrifying implications of a deadly new disease, human beings search for analogous occurrences in the past, for stories of suffering, of resilience, and ultimate recovery. They want to hear the familiar epidemic episodic narrative of beginnings and endings, of the curve rising and falling. I experienced some of this when co-teaching a course on COVID-19 that my colleagues and I had rapidly assembled in 2020 and which evolved with the pandemic. Though we historians are always keen to point out when the lessons of history have not been learned, in this case, we will more often found ourselves cautioning students against drawing conclusions from superficially similar circumstances. In desperation, even getting to the point of saying, only semi-tongue-in-cheek, you can't learn anything from history. At a very simple level, this is because infectious agents are biologically different, even before you get to the complex ways in which they interact with societies. As we know to our cost, preparing for a pandemic of influenza will only get you so far if you're then hit by a coronavirus. But there is another kind of learning from history, less comforting, which we certainly should attempt, a post-colonial perspective in Fanny Chabrol's words. And here we can certainly turn, I think, to African history for some insights. Media accounts of the emergence of COVID-19 presented the zoonotic disease as a consequence of either an unfortunate spillover from non-human to human that had taken place in the Chinese market, or rather more controversially, from a laboratory leak. In either case, there was an assumption that the origins of the pandemic lay in a one-off event that could potentially be traced and with appropriate biosecurity measures in place, not repeated. But understanding the emergence and spread of COVID-19 and indeed other conditions requires a different kind of perspective, one now often framed in terms of planetary health and the Anthropocene, and one that has for some time now been employed by historians of Africa. Not, I think, because we or they are more perceptive than in any others, but because the history of epidemic disease in Africa has seemed to call for a more holistic ecological perspective working in a longer time frame. COVID-19 didn't just emerge out of nowhere in a Chinese market or a lab. It emerged from a long history of the expansion of global capitalism and the ecological disruptions associated with that, including interspecies relationships and climate change. As Lachenal and others have argued, an epidemic seen this way needs to be extended in time, both forwards and backwards, and emerges often as what he calls the presence of the past. We know this from historical examples of epidemics in Africa that don't fit the conventional epidemiological narrative of an exceptional event, rising and falling and bounded by time. Lachenal gives the example of sleeping sickness, an ecological disease par excellence, necessitating an understanding of political ecology, of demography, agricultural systems, climate, and the profound effects of colonial capitalism, and linked to other epidemics, sometimes through the very health interventions devised to combat it. As he shows in his study of Eastern Cameroon, sleeping sickness spoke to the co-presence of deep and more recent pasts. To summarize and simplify a complex story, in the Nyong Basin in the early 20th century, the colonial intrusion into the forests, propelled by the rubber boom and made possible by expanding infrastructure, had brought increased exposure to tsetse flies, the sleeping sickness vector. Demographic decline experienced in many parts of Central Africa in this period resulted in a decline in agriculture and favored tsetse breeding. Colonial interventions to control the resulting spread of sleeping sickness brought further deforestation by concentrating populations and coercive mass campaigns of screening and ineffective treatment compounded the suffering caused by the disease. As Lachenal has shown, the industrial scale French campaigns using unsterile injections accelerated the emergence of both hepatitis C and HIV in the region. And if you thought that that might be the end of this set of intersecting epidemic episodes, then think again. Since the 1970s, the emergence of a debilitating and previously unknown disease, Buruli ulcer, has itself been linked to the prior deforestation of the river basin caused by sleeping sickness control measures. The mycobacterial disease, Buruli ulcer, is also associated with HIV infection and immunosuppression. The Nyong Basin, then, is one example of many where epidemics apparently refuse to end. And if this sounds like a peculiarly African story, it's not, and maybe the future for all of us. Reading the literature on COVID-19 in Africa, the apparently elusive quality of the epidemic on the continent, a virus both present and non-present, the perplexity of the scientists, also reminded me, with some moments of déjà vu, of another epidemic disease, that is yellow fever. Some years ago, I became interested in the work of a group of largely American researchers working on yellow fever in the 1940s from a well-resourced lab funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in Lagos, Nigeria. Thought to have originated in Africa and spread across the Atlantic through the slave trade, this mosquito-borne virus had been responsible for devastating urban epidemics in the Americas, as well as coastal regions of West Africa. Though the large-scale American epidemics had been largely controlled through the discovery of the mosquito vector and with environmental and sanitation measures, with increasing global colonization in the early 20th century and the development of air travel, yellow fever remains a global health security threat, with the particular fear that it might jump into Asia. With urban epidemics mostly controlled, interest turns to so-called jungle yellow fever, its endemic form, and to West Africa. Researchers there in the 1920s and 30s made significant, and here are some of them, made significant advances, developing an immunity test so that they could see who had been infected, and an effective vaccine. But these successes were overshadowed by the scandal of laboratory leaks and the deaths of several scientists. But with the outbreak of the Second World War and the stationing of Allied troops in West Africa and renewed anxiety over yellow fever as a biosecurity threat, the American Rockefeller scientists came back to Lagos. Well aware that yellow fever was a complex ecological disease, they were not at all reductive about this. They understood that it was very complicated. They studied all aspects of its life cycle, the animal reservoirs in the increasingly encroached upon forests, the behavior of the mosquito vectors. But the piece of the jigsaw that constantly eluded them was the clinical manifestation of the disease in West Africans. Without clinical cases, it was difficult for them to trace the different strains of the virus and its evolution, and that's what they really wanted to understand. So like COVID-19, yellow fever seemed to sweep through West African populations largely unnoticed, among other diseases, especially malaria. They knew it was present because they conducted large-scale immunity surveys repeatedly on young children. So by comparing results from generations of children, they could date when the disease had passed through an area, the presence of the past, as Lachenal called it. An opportunity to study an actual epidemic came eventually with the outbreak of the disease in the densely populated southwest town of Ogbomoso in 1947. The overexcited scientists, in almost indecent haste, descended on the town in a cavalcade of mobile laboratories. Local leaders and townsfolk were frankly skeptical, but largely cooperative. The researchers identified some cases and some probable deaths, but they concluded overall that in general, the symptoms in most of the infected were very mild. You might have thought that this was a positive conclusion, but for them, the fact that this did not take off as a full-blown epidemic came as something of a disappointment. Indulge me here with just a bit more of the story, because undeterred, they resorted to attempting to manufacture an epidemic in a region of Cameroon where the colonial authorities were a bit more willing than those in Nigeria to engage in such an ethically dubious enterprise. Having positioned infected monkeys in strategic positions, they waited for the disease cycle to get underway. Ironically, in a region which was so plagued by mosquito-borne disease, the mosquitoes just refused to play a game and the entire experiment failed. Now the Cold War was kicking off. One lesson the leader of the team took away with him was that developing a viable agent of biological warfare might not be that simple. In 1949, the Rockefeller scientists shut down their lab and left for the US, issuing warnings that although yellow fever didn't appear to be a major threat to West African populations, vigilance was needed because this could change. Especially as, though there was a perfectly good vaccine for yellow fever, it had been deemed by the colonial authorities to be too expensive to administer to African populations. And here you can see shades of the COVID vaccine inequity that we've seen now. As the Rockefeller Foundation's annual report stated in 1950, it's not a dead foe, it's only a dormant one. They were at least partially proven right. In the mid-1950s, epidemics of yellow fever broke out in Onitsha and the Jos Plateau. In the 1960s, a devastating epidemic hit Ethiopia. And in 1969, a region-wide epidemic swept across West Africa. Yellow fever is now regarded as a major resurgent epidemic disease in Africa, where 90% of cases globally occur in Africa. And belatedly, in the 2000s, a vaccination program is underway. Meanwhile, yellow fever's cousin, the Zika virus, first identified by the Rockefeller scientists in a forest in Uganda in 1947, resurfaced in the Pacific island of Yap in 2007, and then in a major outbreak in Brazil in 2015. So I began with George Kabala-Barra's plea to get beyond the tiresome opposition of Africa needs help versus no, Africa can teach you a lesson. But I have concluded with a lesson from the long history of complex ecological outbreaks on the African continent, that there are no neat and tidy endings, that the past does manifest in the present in disease patterns as in so much else, and that cutting a road through a forest in one part of the planet might ultimately result in a deadly disease in another. Well, I finished writing this and then I thought, I don't think Stephen would really approve of such a downbeat ending. So I kind of racked my brains a bit. Ever the realist, he nevertheless, and he was a realist, he had a very strong belief in the capacity of humanity to create not just livable lives, but positive ones. So I go back to Seasons of Rain. And as he writes in Seasons of Rain, though the coming of the rains may actually tell us more about the past than the present or the future, it is in our human nature to celebrate, nevertheless, the signs of a new and hopefully productive season. Thank you.